Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the second week of the poetry unit. Hopefully by now you're adequately frustrated with lyrical poetry. That was kind of what my purpose for that unit is, to kind of frustrate you to an extent, but for an educational purpose. So we're into free verse poetry now. And the reason why we're into free verse poetry is because hopefully by now what you've started to understand, and to truly understand, not just like understand it on the basis of somebody told you, but understand it on the basis that you've experienced it and you know it for yourself. The limitations that the poet faces when they try to write in lyrical verse. So you've got an idea you want to express and it doesn't fit. You just can't make it fit, right? It doesn't fit your rhyme scheme, or the line that you want to write is too short or too long for the meter that you're using. And you find yourself spending way too much time trying to like come up with like a word that fits and not spending any time on the ideas at all. And that is like, that's the reality of what happened to poetry at the beginning of the 20th century, is that people started to realize, because this kind of neat thing happens in English literature, where other European cultures, specifically German and French cultures in Europe, got away from lyrical poetry before we did, like in the English tradition. And so there was this sort of like weird transition that happens in the late 1800s and like early 1900s, where like the old tradition just kind of comes to an abrupt end, and the new tradition takes off. And the new tradition is free verse, because that allows the poet to say things that they weren't able to say before. It gives the poet freedom to speak, freedom to express, and you don't have to like waste your time trying to find the word that rhymes with orange. Okay, there's not very many things that rhyme with orange, but it also presents a bit of a problem too. So how do you know if something is or is not poetic when there's no lyricism to it at all? So like that empty room thing that I have in like the first video that I made, I'm going to guess that you've come across poems before similar to that empty room, whatever I said, just ramblings that I came up with, and I'm vague enough, and my word choice is good enough that it sounds like it might be a poem. And you might have found yourself in like a class, like agreeing with the teacher that it was a good poem without knowing why, but you just sort of like smile and nod, pretend that you get it. How do you know though? How do you know that it is or is not a poem? See, here's the downside. With lyrical poetry, it was easy to tell whether something was a poem or not, because you could see it very clearly. Was there a rhyme scheme? Was there a rhythm? How long was the poem? Did it fit the structure it was supposed to fit? And based on that, poetry either was or wasn't poetry. And so it was easy to tell. With free verse poetry, you can't tell that way. It's not on the surface. It's underneath whether something is or is not a poem. So today's activity was for you to think. And hopefully you put a lot of thought into it, because that is, if you've come up with your idea, you've already essentially come up with your next poem. Here's the advice. I don't know if I mentioned this in a video before or not. I think I did though. A few years ago, I had a young man in an English class who, when I told him I was an aspiring writer, he approached me after class once and he said, "Can I show you a story that I wrote? I'd like some feedback on it." So, I took it and I read it, and it was a pretty well, for a grade 10 student, it was a well-written story and everything. And a couple days later, he asked me for the feedback, and I said, well, do you, like, what kind of feedback do you want? Do you want, like, English teacher feedback, or do you want writer feedback? Because the two things are very different. He said, give me the writer feedback. And I said, well, I don't really see a need for your story to exist. And now you got to know that the student that I was talking to was the kind of kid who he handled that well. Like, I knew that he would handle that well. He was a very upfront, direct young man. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, I basically read the story already. This is Red Badge of Courage. It's All Quiet on the Western Front. It's Generals Die in Bed. It's basically one more story about, you know, another war where a soldier goes off to war and comes back disillusioned. And because he had set his in the background of the War of 1812. And I said, it's a very well written story, you know, well crafted and everything, but there's, you know, it tells a story that's already been told. So, you know, but is there something in here that, you know, hasn't been told yet? Is there something new or different that, you know, you can kind of redirect this story with? And that was how our conversation went. What I tried to get across to him was that the story was in the ideas. It's the meaning that's important. And with poetry, with free verse poetry, it is or isn't poetry based on its meaning. If it means something, it's poetry. If it means nothing, then it's not. And so today's activity was all about coming up with some sort of meaning that you can now embed into the poetry that you're going to write. So to use an example, I'll use the example that I posted, my own work from when I was in university, which you know, it's kind of fun to look at it now and going through. And there's parts of that poem, like I edited some of it, but I left most of it the way that it was, even parts that were like making me cringe. Like the parts that were like really cringy, I honestly got rid of. But I left in some of like the poor writing in there too. And it was kind of fun to read it. You know, I haven't even looked at that piece in years, and to look at it now, it was, you know, it was kind of fun. And some of the language is poorly designed, but I still enjoy the poem because to me, I know what the meaning is. When I wrote that poem, I was in like a place in my life where I was kind of like, I guess you'd say disillusioned with life, with the world. I was in that sort of like angsty place that I think that, you know, we all get to, intellectual people get to at some point when they start to basically like, how would you say it? Not to question existence, but to start to notice like a lot of like the problems with the world, with life, with society. I was, it wasn't that I was like at the point where I started to notice that. I had noticed that probably about a year before and started to think more and more about it. I had gotten to the point where I was kind of like fed up and angry with it. And I remember the thing that like got to me the most was I had a friend, and she had this boyfriend who was like just an awful guy. Like he was bad to her. He was like, he was nice-ish, you know, but he treated her poorly without her really like understanding that she was being treated poorly. Like how would you say? You could tell that like it was just like a matter of time before he was going to ditch her for somebody like better, right? And you could just kind of tell. And finally he did, you know, at a certain point he did. And the thing was, like, you know, she was a friend, but I had a crush on her. But I couldn't work up the courage to talk to her about it. And you know, part of it was because, you know, I considered this girl to be out of my league. And I thought, you know, the injustice of the situation that you've got this, you know, kind of like awful guy who's got this really nice girl who I think she genuinely loved the guy, and totally like not oblivious to it. The part that got me was like he knew. I could tell that he knew, like, that, you know, that she was a very nice girl, and that he knew that you know, that she loved him and didn't care. you know, and clearly like actively didn't care and kind of like got a kick out of like treating her bad only to have her sort of like get mad but then come back eventually. That was my take on it, that, you know, he was getting a kick out of that, that it was, you know, that he was self-aware enough to know that like he was the kind of guy who just based on like his looks and his job and his personality could easily go out and you know find a girl that would fall for him, you know. And to me, being like, you know, very insecure and everything, it made me really angry. And so what I tried to do is I tried to like encapsulate that anger, that feeling that I had, that injustice, that root injustice of a world where like that sort of marginalized people, like good people, because I consider myself to be a pretty good guy, but just sort of like takes that kind of guy and just pushes him out to the margin, you know, and like makes him feel, like actively makes him feel like he just doesn't belong. And I figured, you know, there must be like a lot of people out there who feel like me, you know, and as a teacher, you know, like suspicion confirmed. I mean, it's so common for me to see kids who are, you know, who feel that way, who are clearly going through those sorts of emotions. And so the poem was about trying to sort of like encapsulate that feeling and to like kind of like present it in a way where like, you know, the reader who would be feeling like what I would feel would then know that like it wasn't strange to feel that way, that it was like other people had been there and other people are there. So the way that that poem ends with like, you know, I stood here so that you'd see my boot prints, right, and know that I was here. That's the idea that I wanted to get across. And so even when I'm reading this poem, which, you know, language-wise, I'm not really happy with it. I'd love to go through and do thorough edits, but, you know, life gets in the way if you're writing sometimes. That idea, I still love that idea. I still, you know, that, to me, there's meaning there. And hopefully the reader who can sort of like make that connection finds meaning there too, which to me makes it a poem, right? Not like an amazing poem, but it makes it a poem because it says something. So hopefully today you came up with your something. That's what the purpose of today's activity was, to come up with your something. And so what you want to do now, what we're going to be doing for the rest of this week, is we're going to be crafting the poem around that idea. Because when you strip away all the language, you strip away the metaphors and the personification and the alliteration, whatever else you might use to sort of like convey the message, when you strip it all away, that idea is what you're left with, and that idea is what makes your work beautiful. All right, so there's my spiel. And you know, today's activity is going to be up. I'm filming this actually the afternoon, Monday afternoon. By the time I post this, you'll have your next activity, but that's the direction we're going in. We're writing in free verse now, and hopefully you're going to be able to feel the freedom, but also to be able to use that freedom for a purpose, right? Not everybody can be a poet, but anybody can be a poet. That doesn't seem to make any sense. It has to do with your mindset and with your purpose. If you approach poetry with the purpose of saying something, you become a poet. If you approach poetry without having anything to say,